Yeah, many thanks to Jan Hörber and a warm welcome to you all. My name is Winfried Schmitz and I hold a professorship in ancient history in the Institute of Historical Studies at Bonn University. Let me briefly introduce today's lecturer, Dr. Juan P. Luis. Juan Luis is a social historian and a classicist with broad interests in the history of slavery and childhood, and actively involved in scientific research on epigraphy and Roman history from the Republic to the late Roman Empire. He completed his undergraduate degree in history at the National University of Rosario in Argentina, where he took courses on ancient, medieval, and Latin American history. I myself have just completed a new edition of Draco's and Solon's law, the laws of the famous lawgivers in Athens in the beginning of the 6th century BC. And therefore, it is interesting for me to see that Juan Luis has written a BA thesis on the constitutional reforms of Solon. Some years later, Juan Luis obtained his MA at the University of Birmingham and completed in 2013 his PhD at the School of History, Classics and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, a center for research on ancient slavery. He stayed in Manchester and Edinburgh as teaching fellow in Roman history until 2021. And his PhD thesis has the title, What's a Vicarius, also a vicar, substitute, or How True Meaning Can Mislead You, Development and Typology of Subordinated Slaves in Rome, in the time between the 3rd century before and the 3rd century after Christ. Now he is preparing the thesis for publication, and he told me today that he has finished the manuscript and sent it to Edinburgh University Press. So I think that it will be soon published. And there is another coincidence with my own academic career, because during work on his PhD, Juan Luis spent 2008 to 2009, a year as a guest postgraduate student as Marie Curie stipendiat at Bielefeld University, where I myself taught between 1998 and 2003. Now, Juan Luis teaches as a lecturer in ancient history at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the Open University of the United Kingdom. In addition to his dissertation, Juan Luis has published several essays on Latin inscriptions. For instance, a new reading on Inscriptiones Latinae Jugoslaviae, or an essay about Kirkitores from the High Empire to late antiquity, both in ZPE, the Zeitschrift für Papyrologie und Epigraphik, and another essay on reconstructing of missing texts in inscriptions in the journal Epigraphica. In the journal Mnemosyne, he published an essay on the Roman author Varro and his view on slavery. His most recent essay is entitled Agnus Vicarius, a substitute for child sacrifice, published in the proceedings of the conference held at Tunis, L'Epigraphia del Nord Africa, Novità Riletture, Nuove Sintesi in 2020. I'm pleased that Mr. Luis agreed to give a lecture in the Joseph Miller Memorial Lecture Series, and I look forward to his talk with the title Jesus as Slave Owner and its implications for the history of Christianity and slavery. So please, Juan Luis, it's on your turn.
Perfect. Okay. Vielen Dank für Ihre Einladung, meine Vorstellung BCDSS vorzutragen. Ich bin froh, zurück im Land der Dichtung und Denken zu sein, auch wenn nur aus der Ferne. Besonders denke ich, Dr. Bischof für mich zuerst kontaktiert, mir hier in Bonn vorzuschlagen und Professor Schmidt für seine sehr hochherzige Vorstellung. Leider, da ich seit mehr als 10 Jahren in Deutschland nicht mehr wohne, habe ich nicht so viele Chancen, um mein Deutsch zu üben und verbessern, und dann muss ich diesen Vortrag auf Englisch machen. Today I'm going to talk about an aspect of my research which I've been working on for a while and which I know it's a bit controversial. That is whether Jesus of Nazareth and his family and close friends were disciples, and disciples were slave owners. And when I say controversial, I don't just mean that posing the question in itself might hurt sensibilities or even cause outrage in certain quarters, but also that the question itself is difficult to grapple with and answer satisfactorily. Still, I think that there's a good reason to ask these questions, and that engaging with it is a good way of breaking the disciplinary boundaries that usually constrain us. Like discussing whether Jesus was a slave owner brings together several of my owning research interests, for example, slavery as an institution, slavery as an idea, textual criticism of Greek text in this case, the relationship between Rome and its periphery, the complexity of ancient Mediterranean civilization, which I see as a sort of fully developed world or culture, or world market integrated with not just the Mediterranean peoples, but also those of the Black Sea, Mesopotamia, and the Western Indian Ocean. I'd also like to talk about a bit about how I came to this question, because I think it says something about how I see the relationship between teaching and research. I have been interested in the historical Jesus since at least my sweet 16, when my secondary school catechist organized his teaching on Christology as a course on ancient Herodian and Roman Palestine, and introduced us to many problems of the textual tradition of the Gospels. It might seem odd, but I think he was one of my best teachers at school, and one that I remember with most fondness. This interest, however, never translated into proper professional research until a couple of years ago, when I organized a course on ancient ideas of slavery for the University of Edinburgh, which I used to work for until they decided not to renew my contract, to do exactly the same job as I was doing. And I know Germany is not strange to this kind of problem, but British academia. The course focused on the discussions that slavery generated among prominent Greek, Roman, Jewish, and Christian thinkers. And as I was teaching about Philo and Paul and other apostolic fathers, I realized that there was a tiny gap in the scholarship. Nowadays, we like to say that our teaching is research-led, and many institutions see themselves as research powerhouses more than anything else. But I know that Germany is a bit different, because you have great autonomous research institutions, and you still value the importance of teaching at university and at school level in a way that unfortunately is not always appreciated in the English-speaking world. But we are all becoming more Anglified in the last 25 years, and I guess that those of you who are thinking about research or a teaching career will have to deal with and will be affected by this academic ethos. And there are many positives of that, but there are also many negatives. So to me, this investigation has brought to the fore the importance of teaching and the key role that teaching can sometimes play in the orientation of our own research. And I want to vindicate that. It's not just a one-way street, and I hope that teaching-oriented careers were more valued in the system. And I hope that Germany never gets completely Anglified. And I say this as an Anglo-Argentinian, a British citizen, and an Anglophile. So but there are many, many good things about Germany that you should preserve. Okay, enough of that. Let's go back to the topic of the day. What is the gap in scholarship that I've just mentioned? It's been established for quite a long time now that the birth and expansion of Christianity did not mean a substantial amelioration of the condition of slaves. The church never opposed slavery, and even before Christianity became state religion during the course of the 4th century AD, the church had become one of the largest, if not the largest, slave-owning institutions in late antiquity. This fact has troubled many Christian scholars, at least since Henri Vallon published his monumental Histoire de l'esclavage dans l'Antiquité, but probably earlier than that. And this continues making it difficult for many scholars to grapple with these views, especially, for example, we have an article by John Berkeley in the New Journal for New Testament Studies. He says the few, if any, can find in Paul's writings any robust denunciation of slavery. He adds that slavery was so ingrained into the fabric of Greco-Roman societies that it would have been very difficult for Christians to avoid encountering slaves. He says that slavery was so ingrained in the fabric of Greco-Roman society that it would have been very difficult for Christians to avoid encountering slaves in the public domain, even if they decided to forfeit all their slaves. And this created a paradox. Even if the early Christians had wanted it, advocating the liberation of all slaves would have had an extremely detrimental effect on the church. Troubled by this uncomfortable fact, many scholars, particularly in Germany, but also in other countries, have tried to find ways in which Christianity would have brought some relief to Roman slaves and would have eventually helped to undermine the foundations of the institutions. Often, or perhaps always, this effort has been disappointing. For 150 years, scholars have been going on and on about the same small sample of isolated passages in Scripture, looking for minor legal changes, semi-legendary anecdotes about asceticisms and renouncing by early Christian saints and martyrs. All this in a fruitless effort to show that Christianity was a religion of the poor, of the downtrodden, and of course of slaves. This view is nowadays less popular than it used to be, but still 10 years ago or 11 years ago in a chapter on Christian slavery for the Cambridge History of Slavery, Jennifer Glancy could highlight that the first missionary efforts by the nascent Christian community explicitly embraced both slaveholders and slaves. And she even suggested that transcending such differences may have been a cultic ideal. But Glancy had to reckon with the fact that this ideal never materialized, and not only did ancient Christians and the early church fail to oppose slavery, but they also accommodated and profiteered from it. And maybe what I'm going to say doesn't follow the rule of academic etiquette, but from my point of view, everything Glancy has said about that is quite banal. We must never forget that there is nothing particularly Christian in meals in common, in the sharing of goods, or in the embrace of slaves and slaveholders by different sects and ancient religions. Roman slaves participated in various religious ceremonies as members of the familia. They could associate themselves with the collegia or other religious brotherhoods whose members could be sometimes free, sometimes slaves, sometimes freedmen. Slaves worshipped the same pagan gods as the free and participated in the same religious festivals. Indeed, there were cults like Mithraisms in which they entered the presence where the ceremonies took place and even played some fairly important roles, as the epigraphic record shows. So it's been long established that this accommodation of Christianity to slavery can be traced back to the very early history of the church, that is, the Apostolic Fathers themselves. This has been long acknowledged by scholarship. For example, here Glancy stated that Paul, like everyone else, accepted slavery. The social attitudes he betrays in addressing slaves and masters are conventional and conservative, and that's the end of the quote. It was not just Paul who thought this. He was a fairly Hellenized Pharisaic Jew, and he was integrated in the Roman polity. He claimed to be a Roman citizen, so you would expect that. But even other Apostolic Fathers did this, as we can see in the second quote here in the first letter by Peter, who exhorted Christian slaves to be content with their condition and to be wholeheartedly obedient. But even if we see the Apostolic Fathers showing a fairly enlightened attitude towards slaves, like Paul did with Onesimus in his letter to Philemon, the whole discussion, as Harold has suggested in 2006, and that's the third quote there, is not evidence to Onesimus' story, but to Paul's participation and deep implication on ancient slavery. Even in his famous article, which later became a section of his monumental class struggle in the ancient world, the St. Croix pointed out that Jesus accepted slavery as a fact of his environment, just as it is accepted in the Old Testament, and his followers, and he emphasized that his followers accepted and adapted the prevailing Greco-Roman view. Incidentally, I think that actually the St. Croix was wrong about whose views Jesus' disciples were adopting and adapting. I don't think that slavery in ancient Galilee or Judea were qualitatively different from Greco-Roman equivalents, even though there are some peculiarities to each polity. Jesus' disciples and the early Christians were Orthodox Messianic Jews, ultimately Jews, and their ideas about slavery had Jewish roots. They didn't need to adapt a foreign slave world because that was a foreign institution originated from a foreign lands. They had slavery in their midst. But whatever you think about the characteristics of slavery in the ancient non-Romanized Mediterranean, there is no doubt that the early Christians followed in the footsteps of their Jewish, Greek, Roman contemporaries rather than to oppose them. And this is now this sort of communist opinion, not only among anti-Christians, militant atheists, or secular historians, even historian trains in the Christian traditions, even Christians themselves acknowledge this. It is interesting, however, and that's why I highlighted followers, this accommodation of early Christian churches with the institution of slavery itself is often seen as a contradiction, as a dilemma, as a paradox, and sometimes is viewed as a deviation from the true message of the Lord and as an abandonment of the practices of early Christian communities, which are often seen as a sort of socialist communes in which wealth and property was shared among their members and social differences melted away. And this view, of course, stems from this passage from the Acts of the Apostles, in which it says that now all who believe were together, and they had all their things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and divided them among all, and anywhere as anyone had need. So this has generated a lot of contradictions, because how do you reconcile this with the early Christian attitude to slavery? There are people, again, like the St. Croix, who again says that the opinions of Jesus and property and wealth were closer to those of Bertolt Brecht than to those held by some fathers of the church and by some Christians today. So they see that as a paradox, as a deviation of the followers from the message of the founder of the sect. And many of you, or some of you, I don't know who is in the audience, but they may be too young to remember, but there was a time not too long ago when comparisons between Che Guevara and Jesus were de rigueur. Some pronouncements of Pope Francis are in line with this view. No matter what you might think of the material conditions of life in the Vatican, they tend to think that, well, Jesus was one thing, his followers were another thing. But in any case, be that this accommodation with slavery is seen as intrinsic to private Christianity, be it seen as a deviation from the true Christian spirit, the emphasis of the scholarship has always been on Jesus' followers rather than on the man himself. Even if we take the St. Croix article into consideration. For example, Richard Roth, that I have quoted here at the bottom, conceptualized St. Paul's letter to Philemon as a design for mastery. That is a blueprint for slave domination. But she went as far back as St. Paul. According to her, to Roth, building a church without using slave labor and without the theoretical and theological basis that slavery provided in your religion was impossible. To overcome this impossibility, the programmatic objective of St. Paul, but not of Jesus, of St. Paul, was to define a new project of domination that set the tone for his successors for centuries to come, transforming the history of the early church into an ongoing history of slavery. So we always see that the emphasis is what happens after Jesus. But what about Jesus? What about Jesus himself? Okay, prima facie, we must keep in mind that like other religious leaders like Muhammad, he not only was the owner of slaves, that his saints collected in the hadith created a theology on the slavery of infidels and on the slavery of women, of enemies defeated in war. Our sources in Jesus do not present him as a slave master, at least explicitly so. We do have that of the patriarchs, we do have that of the kings of Israel, we do have everything that, we do have that about Muhammad, but it's not that clear about Jesus. This notwithstanding, as Glancy pointed out in her study of slavery in early Christianity, Jesus himself relied on the figure of the slave in his teaching, as this quote shows at the top. Well, this has no major consequence for my hypothesis. It just means that Jesus used the social reality of his time to convey his apocalyptic message of salvation. The gospel passages where Jesus talks about slavery or uses slavery as a narrative strategy to present the good news in a simple way to his followers have been identified by authors like Weiser or Crosar as Jesus' servant or slave parables, most of which I have listed here, like the doorkeeper, the talents, the unworthy servant, etc. Often, however, analysis of these parables has focused on the metaphorical nature of the parables, as if Jesus mostly used them to talk about the oncoming end of times and the kingdom of heaven, especially those underlined here in bold type, much less so as if he was talking about slavery of his own time. So how these parables relate to Jesus' own ideas on slavery has not been emphasized enough, and maybe with the only exception of Glancy, who tried to delve into it and try to find if there was any coherent theory of slavery underpinning those parables. So before I discuss some of them, I want to point out two things. I'm sure that you know that the main source of the life of Jesus are the four Gospels, but there are many more than the four Gospels. And on the one hand, we have the three so-called synoptics, those of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and on the other, the Gospel of John. The synoptic Gospels derive their name from the Greek synopsis, or vision of the whole, and because they all provide an account of the most important event of the life of Jesus, there are many parallels between these three Gospels, and in general, it is believed that they are based on a common source, the so-called Q or Bellin, although I know that there's a big debate about that. And then we have the Gospel of John, that on the other hand is later and has more of theological, philosophical character. I know that the history of the Gospel text and the development of the textual tradition is a very complex problem, and I don't have time to delve into the details, so I'm not going to talk much about it. But I want to highlight one thing. As you can see, the slave parables are preserved mostly in the synoptic Gospels, and they are almost absent from the Gospel of John. The parable of the doorkeeper and of the wicked tenants are preserved in the so-called triple tradition, that is here marked in purple. There is a tradition preserved by the three synoptic Gospels, probably the oldest tradition. The parable of the talents is found in the so-called double tradition, that is Mark and Luke. Matthew and Luke. But it's not found in Mark, so it's probably a later edition. And then the parable of the unworthy servant or the unjust steward are found only in Luke, and the unmerciful servant only in Matthew. So probably there are even later additions that did not make to the general tradition shared by all the Gospels. But all of them are preserving these early traditions and not in the later, more philosophical ones of John. And the fact that Mark is the oldest of the canonical Gospels, the fact that they are preserved here is a good reason to think that these Gospels at least are closer to the original story of the historical Jesus. The double tradition was developed later and certainly added other stories and parables, more so those that are preserved only in one Gospel. But when we look closer at them, we see that there's a sort of remarkable ideological consistency. So there are, in my view, some historical roots to these views of slavery among the very early Christians, and possible from Jesus himself. So let's focus now on one specific issue. Who was this Jesus of Nazareth I'm talking about? And I think that here, crucial to my hypothesis is to identify if there was some historical Jesus that was not contaminated, or at least less contaminated by mythical and messianic elements added by the authors of the Gospels. I know that the historical Jesus question is an extremely complicated one, but at least we can agree that the Jesus of the Gospel is a construct of at least three figures or narratives. First, we have the Jesus of the birth in Bethlehem, the infant Jesus, which is almost certainly fictional and was created for genealogical purposes to give legitimacy to the new sect. King David was born in Bethlehem in the tribe of Judah, so the prophets prophesied that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem near Jerusalem. At least Micah did it in 5:2. Then we have Jesus coming from Galilee in the northern part of Palestine. So from the beginning, it was stumbling block from the legitimacy of Christianity and the Christian pretensions to be the followers of those that prophesied Messiah. So they had to invent these early birth and infancy story. But it's interesting that these stories are not preserved by Mark, only by Matthew and Luke, who talk about the migration from Nazareth to the south and then to Egypt and so on and so forth. It's never mentioned by Paul, for example. So I think that we can establish that this idea of the poor Jesus, the refugee Jesus, of the stories of the infancy are completely false and completely created and have no bearing to our views of the historical Jesus. They have no historical basis. We also have the Jesus of the Passion, the one who chased the merchants out of the temple, the one who got arrested, tortured, finally died willingly on the cross. And the interesting thing is that the main events in this sort of kamikaze Jesus are located all in the Jerusalem area, as you would expect from theological reasons. This part of the gospel story is the center for the Christian message, and because without the Messiah's sacrifice on the cross, without his resurrection, there's no Christianity, but it's immaterial to my hypothesis. I don't need it to have historical basis. It might have had historical basis, it might have not. We don't know. My views on the trial of Jesus make me think that what the early Christians knew about that was really, really complex and probably there's a lot of fabrication there. But whether that Jesus was historical or not is irrelevant. I'm not saying that the crucifixion is false. I'm saying that it doesn't matter for us. However, when we go to the Galilean ministry, we are, I think, in much more solid historical ground. Yes, the Galilean preacher went to Jerusalem, that he's preaching put the authorities in tenterhooks is likely, but what matters is that Galilean Jesus, as he is in Galilee, has all the trappings of a historical figure. And that Jesus spent most of his ministry in the area marked here with the blue circle. And I think that when we look at the social conditions of that, we see that makes a lot of sense to my hypothesis. First century Galilee was full of apocalyptic preachers and rabbis like the Galilean Jesus. His interactions are very possibly historical and depict a world that can be recognized from other sources. The fact that his main ministry is in Galilee strengthens his historicity, because if you only need a mythical figure, if you only need a theological Messiah, you just put it in Jerusalem, you make it die on the cross, and that's it. No, so the early Christians preserved that guy. So the probability that this Jesus, the Jesus of the slave parables, the Jesus that talked about slavery, that used slavery as a metaphor, was a historical person, are, in my view, likely or possible. And if you look at this, when you look at Galilee, Phoenicia, his ministry in Galilee, Phoenicia, and the Decapolis, and we compare it with his ministry in Judea and Perea, what we see that all the episodes that take place in the South are narrated in more detail by John, while the other parables, the interactions, social interactions in the North, are mostly preserved in the Synoptic Gospels. There are a few anecdotes in the North that are also preserved by John, and some of them are relevant to my hypothesis. But what I want to emphasize is that the historical Jesus, the one that is preserved in the triple tradition, the one that is preserved by the Synoptic Gospel, is a Galilean Jew, is someone who has all the trappings of a historical figure. And it's almost absent in John, apart from episodes like the wedding of Cana, that it's quite important for my hypothesis. But still, those that are important for my hypothesis in this case are placed in Galilee, in the milieu of that historical Jesus. So if we accept all this, it then follows that when we look at the way in which Jesus speaks of and about slaves in his parables, we can pin down what his followers preserved through oral tradition and word of mouth, if not of the historical Jesus, at least of what it was being said of the historical Jesus and his relationship to slavery. And here the picture that emerges is not the most enlightened one, let alone one coming from a meek and mild figure. So let me dedicate some time to some of them. We can start with the parable of the worthy servant, in which Jesus tells his disciples that nobody would recline at the table with his slave after the poor man has been working all day in the fields. Instead, we would compel the slave to serve us. Only when we finish eating and drinking, would that slave have the chance to eat and drink himself. The slave would have to accept this order of things and would not have to expect to be thanked for doing his duty. He's asleep. In the parable of the doorkeeper, where the master of the house, the dominus, commands his slave, the doorkeeper, to stay awake, to be always ready in case he's needed by his master, the doorkeeper and all other slaves must always be vigilant. They don't have the right to rest. In the parable of the talents, one of our best illustrations of how the concept of the segula, the Jewish equivalent of peculium, worked, we have a slave master who allocates some money to 3 of his slaves, 10 to 1, 5 to the second one, 1 to the third. And as Roman slaves did with peculium, these slaves of the parable use their money as if they were independent entrepreneurs. 2 of them invest the money, they bring revenue for the master. The other one just goes, buries them. And he does that according to the gospel text itself, because the Dominus was a hard man who reaps what he hasn't sown. End quote. So that's the gospel. That's no interpretation. That is in the text of the gospel. The master, of course, goes mad. He goes mental. He rebukes the slave for not furthering his own interests, the interests of the master. He calls the slave wicked, lazy. He takes the talent away from him, gives it to the slave who has received 10 talents. He then sends the poor slave to a dark place full of shadow, probably the gaslamum or the domestic prison for rebellious slaves. We also have the parable of the merciful servant, preserved only in the Gospel of Matthew, which is even more telling. Among the many interesting features of this story is that it preserves one of the few testimonies we have of the possible survival of debt slavery in Eastern Mediterranean, long after it was abolished elsewhere. But here what matters is that we have a man owned by a king who owed that king 10,000 talents, a huge amount of money. And then the king orders to seize the debtor and his family as security and slave. And he enslaves his family, the man and his family. The debtor asks for mercy. He obtains mercy from the king. But when he bumps into another fellow slave who owns him a petty sum of 100 denarii, he chokes him and casts him into prison. And as soon as the king got to know what his debtor had done, he gets really angry, as Yahweh always gets angry, and orders his guard to seize him and to deliver him to jailers until he should pay all his debt. Interestingly, Matthew uses the word basanistes, which does mean jailer, but also means torturer. So we do not pay back your debts to God, to the supreme slave master. You risk being sent to the torture rack. In the previous parables, Jesus is talking about the Father. So we could always argue that, well, he's talking about a patriarchal entity, a celestial pater familias, a kind of celestial Kim Il-sung, unsympathetic, charmless figure, and yet that is to be expected. But what role does Jesus see for himself in all this? And the answer can be found in the last parable of which I will speak, that is the parable of the wicked tenants, where we have a landowner who plants a vineyard and then instead of cultivating it himself with his slaves, he leases his property to some peasants, an economic strategy that was common in the Mediterranean. And when he sends his slaves agent to collect the rents, the peasant tenants kill the slave. The landowner sends another slave, and then another slave, and then the tenants do the same time and time again. And after all this murder of slaves, the landowners decide to send his beloved son. The tenants, of course, will kill the son, try to seize his inheritance. And this is clearly a foretaste of Jesus' prophesied death on the cross. But what interests us is that, as Clancy noted before me, I'm not being very original here, but the Son of Man, that is Jesus, saw himself as an heir of land and slaves, as someone who would eventually become that landowner and slave master. When Jesus plays a role in these parables, he might not be the ungrateful, control freak, vindictive Dominus who he compares God with in his parables, but he's imbued with the role and sees himself as a future Dominus. Maybe he will become ungrateful, control freaky, and vindictive, but there's no way to know. I would not let pass then, as Clancy has also pointed out, the owner of the vineyard only takes revenge when tenants, farmers kill their sons. He goes and destroys disrespectful tenants and gives the vineyards to new tenants, not to the slaves. Before the killing of his son, the landowner seems to be concerned only with his rents. The underlying premise seems to be that owners should only be rehabilitated if a free member of your family is killed. Slaves have no honor, and their death is deplorable, yes, but only as far as it's detrimental to the master's interests. But it's not serious enough to seek revenge, only when a member of your family is touched. And when I mean your family, not your familia, but only your relatives. So, if we peruse the parables, we can see that they were put together and transmitted from the point of view of slave owning classes. Good slaves must do what they are told without opposing their condition. Slaves are under constant pressure. Good, faithful, industrial servants are rewarded. Bad servants are severely punished. The master is always revengeful. Most importantly, nowhere does Jesus show any sympathy for slaves. And it is as if for him, the master's interests are paramount. Okay, these are parables, exemplary moral stories which the tradition puts in Jesus' mouth. Whether they represent the true words of Jesus is difficult to know. There are people in this audience who are surely more qualified than me to discuss the problem of attribution. What we need to discuss then is the social standing of the man who seems to be reproducing the views of the slave-owning class. Who was this Galilean Jesus? Who was his social standing? Galilee was certainly not peripheral, and was not close to the center of power, but it was certainly not poor. And the area around which Jesus spent most of his ministry was fairly densely populated, but lacked big urban settlements. Jesus, however, was not a peasant. Although the Gospels are full of agricultural metaphors and imagery, real peasants are almost absent. Apart from the episode of the corn ears, in which he sees his disciples cutting corn on the Shabbat, but we see that doing this just randomly, not as it was their daily occupation. I was saying he was not a peasant. He has practically no direct relationship with peasants, although he knew quite a lot about agricultural labor, as you would do if you live close to the peasantry. His ministry, however, is mostly in semi-urban communities, in small villages, in small towns, sometimes even in Jerusalem. But there are other social aspects of his life that we can know. For example, there's no doubt that he was a rabbi from Galilee, that he's a teacher of laws and scripture. We know that because he's called so many times. His behavior, his clothes, his beliefs, his doctrines, his methods place him among Pharisaic, Mishnaic Judaism. Even if saying what specific faction of first century Judaism he belonged to is not always to pin down. I have some examples here. His discussion of the law of the Sabbath, or his views of afterlife and damnation. Also, the way he reflects about Jewish purity laws and so on and so forth. Clearly, he was quite versed in Jewish theology. As a rabbi, he was very probably literate. He was able to read, at least, probably even to write. We know that this because he reads in the synagogue. He reads Isaiah 61 in the Synagogue of Nazareth. I know that he's called by John Mime the cause, that is not learning or illiterate, but Keith has already dealt with it so quite convincingly, and I think that he had at least some functional literacy, even if he never achieved scribal literacy. So he was certainly not a poor man, and this somehow contradicts our ideas, confuses us, because he's famously called a carpenter, that is a tecton, or the son of the carpenter, or to tectonus Ios, by two evangelists, not just one. And we don't tend to see these type of occupations as something that affluent people or rich people would do, especially slave owners would be involved with. But what does it mean to be a carpenter, or what did it mean to be a carpenter in first century Galilee? And recently, Stanton has argued that tecton denotes a building constructor rather than a simple joiner. Stanton even adds that Jesus and his father came from an entrepreneurial sector of society like CBD, James and John, or Andrew and Simon fishing partnership, and here is highlighted in red. So the possibility that he and his father, Joseph, owned slaves, at least has become plausible and even probable. There's nothing strange about a Galilean rabbi doing manual or entrepreneurial work after, or even at the same time as they pursued their trade as interpreters of the law, because we know from different traditions that many first and second century rabbis engage in business, and I have a list here, like Hilariah the woodcutter, or Paul the tent maker, and so on and so forth. I know that this tradition is sprung long after Jesus lived and his life was recorded, and the Talmud is much later. Both Talmud are much later than the Gospels, but at least we can agree that they render the idea of a member of a semi-urban entrepreneurial class who had the means to own slaves and who later became a preacher and scholar of the law, at least plausible. Much more so when we consider how Jesus related to the real world of slavery. Rather than to the metaphorical one, we see many interesting features. For example, it is very telling that there are no slaves among his 12 disciples. And even moreover, that some of his disciples may have been slave owners themselves. Like, for example, Matthew was a tax farmer. The son of Zebedee employed hire slaves, mithote, or probably people of lower standing. Many of Jesus' friends and patrons were slave owners, or at least had servants in the banquets Jesus is often seen at. Jesus himself is seen as a man of authority, used to giving orders. For example, when the Roman centurion asked Jesus to heal his dying slave, he claims to be a man of authority as well, implying that Jesus is also one. He adds that he gives order to subordinates and to his slaves, and those orders are followed, saying, well, probably if you do the same because you're also slave master, your orders would be followed. And then there are two episodes in which we see Jesus performing almost as a slave master. And the first one is the marriage of Cana in Galilee, preserved only in John, where we see slaves or servants being asked by Mary to do whatever Jesus tells them, that is, to follow the orders of a master. Of course, these slaves, these diaconi or these servants, were not his own slaves, his own servants, but it is interesting that they are being given orders in the manner that they would be given orders by any master. And the second episode, of course, comes from the Last Supper, and is when Jesus washes the feet of his disciples and puts himself in the position of slave, but at the same time making it very, very clear who the Kyrios is. And the master is, of course, himself. So when I say, as I said at the beginning, these episodes are preserved in the Gospel of John. It is difficult to assess their historicity. It is interesting, however, that at least when it comes to one of those episodes in which he is telling slaves what to do, he's put in the proper role of a master. It's set in Galilee, that is close to the milieu of the historical Jesus. So I'll recapitulate this after this accidental use of PowerPoint and Zoom presentation, and I try to wrap up and finish. So what have we learned from all this? Well, what we learned is that the attitude to slavery of the early church apostolic fathers that most scholars have talked about, usually focusing on the followers of Jesus, sometimes as a paradox, sometimes as a deviation from what Jesus would have done, actually stemmed from Jesus' own views. He was a conservative. He accepted slavery. He did never oppose it. There's nothing against slavery said in his parables. So his slave parables might be metaphorical, but they reflect the point of view of slave owners. The interests of slave owners are paramount. Poor slaves are very badly treated there. And they express no sympathy for slaves. Unless they advance the interests of the masters, then Jesus would say, well, yeah, that's okay. But if not, they are quite harsh with slaves. Second, Jesus, the poor man, is a myth. He could read. He became a member of the intellectual class, the rabbi. He was probably a member of the semi-urban entrepreneurial class. His acquaintances were kind of people of some means, of some cultural importance in the region. He was used to giving orders. He was used to play the role of a master. So his family, many of his friends, probably some of his disciples owned slaves themselves. So my view is that even if Jesus was not a slave owner himself, his family, his friends, his many were certainly slave owners. So Jesus himself came from the slave owning class and belonged to the slave owning class. Vielen Dank. I will now take questions from the audience, and I apologize for all these problems. Thank you.